Hello, and welcome to My Therapist's a Witch. If this is your first time listening, my name is Elizabeth. I am a somatic psychotherapist in training, and I'm currently working towards my licensure. I also happen to be a person that has PMDD, which stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, ADHD, and complex PTSD. And this is a space where I like to talk about and share some of the knowledge and experiences that I've gained on my own healing journey. I also happen to identify as a witch. And for me, that word really links to the sensation of being wise. And I also believe that spiritual practices of any kind can only help aid us on our healing journey. So for today's episode, I thought we could sit down, light some incense candles, sit in a pretty robe, whatever feels good for you, and just have a chat about being a highly sensitive person. I identify as a highly sensitive person. I have a bit of a, trauma-informed lens to being an empath and being a highly sensitive person. And I've really noticed in my own experience how being sensitive in this way has dictated and influenced the stories that I tell myself. So my relationship to myself. So I thought we could start by me sharing a little bit about my experience as a highly sensitive person and how it relates to my story. So I come from a somatic lens of psychology, and that's really a more bottom-up approach to mental health. It really focuses on how we can incorporate the body, movement, awareness of the nervous system into psychology and also our mental health, and how, we are beings that live in a body. So if we're going to start to root around in our minds, we should probably bring the body along for it, particularly when we're working with trauma. So, as I've said before, I'm someone who has complex PTSD, and this type of PTSD is mostly from an accumulation of toxic stress from childhood. So, what do I mean by that? Well, for me, in my younger little body, I grew up in an environment and in a family system where I had to be hyper vigilant. So both my parents weren't very predictable. I had a lot of misattunement as a child, and I was also a parentified child. So at some point in my young little life, I started taking on more of a parent role for both of my parents. So what this can do from a more somatic lens and how we grow and how our relationship to ourself starts to develop is that my nervous system was on all the time. So I was anticipating danger all the time. And in someone who is not living in toxic stress or who is living in an environment where their needs are met and they are being attuned to, they don't need to be in this state. So for me, it was an adaptation that my body naturally started to do in order to seek safety. And for me, that really came online around emotions. So at a very young age, I learned how to hyper-attune to people's emotions, because I learned that there were certain emotions that if my parents felt, that it meant bad things for me happened. And then there were other emotions that if my parents felt them, good things happened to me. So because I was aware of this and feeling this, I would have often a trauma response when one of those not so great emotions was activated in one of my parents, even when I felt it. And so as I grew up in this state of hypervigilance, hyperattunement, my body kind of being always buzzing and on, I became extremely sensitive to my environment. I became extremely sensitive to the subtle cues and kind of the space between words. And it's my perspective that this ability came online because I experienced trauma growing up. And so it's a traumatic adaptation that my body took on in order to keep myself safe. Now, I don't think everyone who identifies as a highly sensitive person immediately correlates to having experienced trauma, but I do get curious about the type of attunement or the type of sensitivity that's happening. So I'm not saying that everyone who identifies as a highly sensitive person has experienced trauma, but as someone who has experienced trauma and who also identifies as a highly sensitive person, I've seen quite a high rate of correlation just in my own life of meeting folks who identify in this way who have also experienced adverse, overwhelming childhood experiences. So there is, in my perspective, a correlation happening. I thought we could kind of shift a little bit. And now that I've shared kind of my perspective on being a highly sensitive person, like how that starts to infiltrate our mind, how that starts to infiltrate our relationship to ourself. So in my body and in my story, being a highly sensitive person meant that I always felt like I didn't actually belong. And I lived for a very long time, and I still do actually, with these sort of underlying sensations of not belonging, feeling like I'm making people uncomfortable, feeling like I have to wear certain masks or a facade, and this really deep limiting belief that if people really knew how I felt and I shared how I really feel, that then they wouldn't like me. And all of these sensations and thoughts and stories that my body tells myself in this way is directly linked to the trauma that I've experienced. And this sensation and these kind of symptoms that I'm describing do fall under complex PTSD. Now, just honoring that, I'd like to take this conversation and shift it a little bit into a more holistic frame and how I started to create a better relationship to this persistent feeling that I'm weird or odd or that I don't belong. When I really started to become aware of my trauma and my unique body, I moved heavily into my spiritual practice for relief. For me, my spiritual practice is where my trauma and my other symptoms from PMDD or ADHD don't really get to touch me during that time. It's a totally safe space for me to just really be in communion with myself. So as I moved into this practice of being with myself, of taking out things that really stressed me out and creating just an absolute safe container for me to be in, I started to notice the stories that my mind was telling me in order to make sense of these sensations and often overwhelming sensations that I was having. I experience life like a raw, exposed nerve. So I am extremely sensitive to not just emotions in other people, but also my environment. I also have synesthesia, so I kind of have this intense experience when I listen to music and certain sounds where I get a visual stimulus. So for me, being in a group of people, I think has always been pretty overwhelming, even when I was younger and I wasn't really aware what was going on. So as I deepened into myself, I started to meet these stories that my brain was telling me in order to make sense of why I was feeling so different or why I was feeling so much. And a common story for me that I met was the story that I make people uncomfortable. So as someone who hyper attunes in a group, I often attune to the person that's feeling the shittiest. And I can really feel when someone is not very interested in what I'm saying. I can feel when someone is kind of just waiting for their turn to talk. And I can really feel the subtle shifts of emotion that happen. And over time, I learned that that ability made people feel uncomfortable because a lot of people don't actually want to be fully seen and, for that matter, felt. And it made me feel like I was wrong in some way because I couldn't quite tell why I was having this experience. And I was seeing that it was making people uncomfortable. My story got placed on myself where, oh, I must be the problem. It's my fault. So for a really long time, I kind of rejected this sensitivity, particularly in a group of people. I would try to ignore it and I would just barrel through my own feelings. But that left this part of me behind. And the longer that I did that for, the more distressed I started to feel and the more uncomfortable I started to get kind of leading into social interactions. And also I would get this blowback after where I would just feel completely and utterly drained afterwards. So then I started to pay attention to just how negative these stories were and how self-critical these stories that I was telling myself were. And as I moved into a deeper relationship with them, I then moved into being externally referenced. And I think it's fair to say gaslighting myself a little bit. So when I moved in with my partner, a very lovely person who I trust, I was noticing how we would have very different experiences with groups of people. For him, he would be having a great time. He would feel like hanging out with 10 or 20 people was awesome, while I would be dissociating midway through the interaction. And then I would have a meltdown and kind of cry once everybody left because I was just so overwhelmed. And at first, I started almost reality checking myself where I would ask him, hey, I'm feeling this. Did you feel that? And at first, I think it was good for me to really become aware of just how different our experiences were and me noticing just how sensitive I was. Then came the part in my journey where I needed to accept that I feel things intensely. I often feel things that most people don't experience, and that it doesn't mean that they're wrong or bad or that I'm making it up. So I then moved into this practice of really trusting my feelings. And that can be really difficult because when you are in a group of people and on the surface, everyone is pretending that they're having a good time, everyone's laughing, everyone's having these like chats and interactions, but you're noticing, I don't know if this person's actually having a good time. I kind of feel like this person is feeling X, Y, and Z. Now, I will just add that some level of projection is probably happening for sure. However, I would really notice the moments when someone would kind of sit back, their face would go kind of blank, or they'd start to fidget. And over time, I started to begin to trust myself and go, maybe this isn't a projection. Maybe this isn't all in my head. maybe this person is having an experience that's a little divergent as well. And so when I really started to track my own ability to track was when I started to change the story that I told myself. So rather than I'm the problem, I'm too sensitive, I'm making people uncomfortable, I need to just get a grip, the story started to shift to I'm noticing. And when I made that reframe, I started to feel a bit more at ease in a group of people, where now it wasn't my fault that someone was feeling this way, but I could acknowledge that I was noticing something was happening. Then came the part in my journey where I stopped labeling the sensation that I was feeling. Now, this is a piece of my journey, and I think it's inspired by the fact that I sit with people as a therapist. And I've learned that a feeling that I'm having in my body does not always mean the same thing to someone who's feeling the same sensation in their body. So what do I mean by this? I can notice in this moment that I'm feeling warm in my chest. There's sort of this sensation of expansion. And I'm noticing that there's this sort of push or movement outward. So the sensation I'm having is my chest is warm, and there's this expanded feeling, this sort of going outward sensation. And now I could say that that feeling is a feeling of calm. But if I break it down to the sensation, now I'm getting really curious of how calm is showing up in my body. And when you go through that process in the therapeutic space, it gives the other person that you're sitting with time and space to label or define that sensation for themselves. And it can also open the door for them to begin to really break down what a feeling physically feels like in their body. And when we move to that level of sensation, where we're not even being judgmental by labeling something, it then creates a little bit of space where perhaps emotions that were not allowed when we were children, or that often are too overwhelming to experience, gives them a little bit of space to be felt in a way that we can handle, that feels safe enough to let just a little bit of that sensation in. So as I took this practice into my daily life, it allowed me to remove this sense of responsibility. It removed this sort of fear that I had of, whoa, am I just projecting this? It removed this also self-critical part of like, well, is this your ego, Elizabeth, just popping in because you're a highly sensitive person? Like, you know, that's definitely a part that I have that I often try to keep in check. But what I started to notice was that it offered a space for my sensitivity to exist alongside the safety of being social. It gave it a container where now I could be with these feelings that I had and kind of ride them a bit like a wave, almost like I'm surfing through it. And that experience allowed me to create enough space that now my window of tolerance expanded in group situations, where I could be in group situations for longer without being overwhelmed and without having a total meltdown after. And for me, it really became a practice in trusting my own feelings, validating my own feelings, and not needing to externally reference everything like I had done at one point in my healing journey. So to summarize, a practice that I did that really helped me change the stories I was telling about myself was that instead of going, oh, I'm feeling X, Y, and Z, or I'm feeling this person's X, Y, and Z, I started to sit in a mindfulness practice of I'm noticing that I'm feeling X, Y, and Z. I'm noticing that when I sit with this person, I feel X, Y, and Z. And as I did that over and over and over again, I started to see a pattern. And this pattern moved me all the way back into my childhood, where I started to notice that certain emotions I found activating or triggering. I prefer the term activating, but it activated me in my fight or flight response or my stress response. And when I started to notice that, I then also started to see the emotions that I did not have that response with. And I'm just going to let you know, it's probably not what you think. So I actually have a very small window capacity to feel excitement. So when people are really enthusiastic and happy and excited and they're like, whoo, I find that overwhelming. I actually, on some level, find that threatening because of how my nervous system developed when I was younger. And on the flip side of that, I actually find a lot of comfort and I have a pretty wide window of tolerance for sadness, for grief, for kind of lower energy emotions, stuff that's a bit heavy. And when I noticed that, and this happened with a lot of other emotions that I was feeling, I got really curious about it. And I started to ask myself, this is interesting, Elizabeth. This is really interesting because you're actually finding comfort and attuning to most emotions that people find uncomfortable, generally speaking. And so because my body found comfort in the uncomfortable, I think it made it very easy for me to then attach to the story that I make people feel uncomfortable. And that's just not true. I think on some level, for some people, I probably do make them feel uncomfortable, but it's not my intention and it's not my responsibility. And I think that was a huge key component for me, was letting go of that and really sitting in my own power and agency of like, yeah, I do feel a lot. Yeah, I do find these things comfortable and I find these things uncomfortable, and that's okay. And just sitting in it and creating more space inside of myself to kind of ride the full spectrum of sensation and emotion that I was feeling in a group of people. So now comes the part where, okay, this is all great. This is wonderful. Great reframe. But wow, this sounds like a lot of work. And what do you do when you're in a group of people and you are feeling utterly overwhelmed? Well, do I have a practice? I think it's safe to say that for people who identify as empaths or highly sensitive, that often you can feel pretty drained by people, and you can feel, some people call it vibes, other people call it energy, but there's just this sort of tone that you pick up off of people that can feel intrusive, that can feel like it's just penetrating you, and no matter what you do, you can't escape it. And this can, create a story that, oh, I just don't like that person. That person's an asshole. Ugh. Right? But on the flip side, it could also be that something is happening here in relationship with this person that is activating your material. That something about their tone, their way of being, just who they are, without any intention on their part, is making a sensation in your body arise that makes you uncomfortable, that feels distressing, that perhaps is activating something from your trauma story on a very unconscious level. So, a little bit of story time. Several months ago, me and my partner had some folks over at our house. And at first, I was very excited to see these people because I love these people. These people are our friends. I have missed them. At this point, I had kind of been in my cave of writing my long last paper for my graduate program, and I was very stressed out. So I was really excited to see these people. And everyone came over. We're all sitting around our living room, and probably within 30 minutes, I started to feel extremely overwhelmed. And I was noticing how no one was actually talking to me. I was just sitting there, and, there were like 5 different conversations happening at the same time. And I had that experience where you're the one person in the group that is not a part of any of the conversations. And so you try to like focus in and listen on one conversation, but then another person gets louder and you miss what this other person said. So I was just sort of caught in this very turbulent space of feeling like I was experiencing so much sensation. My body was creating all of this story in my mind to justify why I was feeling so bad. And I wanted to run away. I just wanted to escape. And we live in a small condo, and I felt, well, I can't just get up and go in my room because what's that going to say to people? And so I sat there for a really long time on the verge of crying. And from my past, I'm actually a really good hider. So I can hide in a group really well. But my partner, who's very attuned to me, could kind of tell something's going on. I was very quiet. And I just kind of was sitting in between 2 people, feeling sort of the floor disappear below me. And I could get a really clear sense of, I am dissociating in a really heavy way. And I'm dissociating because I'm feeling stressed, threat, and overwhelmed. So after that experience, and when everybody left, I didn't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I just needed to process. And I just ended up crying with my partner. And I could very clearly articulate how I was feeling and why I was feeling that way. And, I'm very lucky. I have a very loving, supportive partner who just held that space for me and let me kind of wring out the activation that I had been holding on to that whole night. But after that experience, I asked myself the question, well, how do I want to be in a group? Like, how do I actually want to be, rather than feeling like I'm just at the whim of whatever sensations come over me within a group? So I started a practice where I started to really focus on my energy body. And now for me, what this means is that I visualize the space kind of like my aura, or just the space outside of my body where I can still feel myself. So I tend to feel my aura or my energy very close to my physical body. So right now, I kind of exist here, pretty close. And when I'm in a group of people, because I naturally sit this close to myself energetically, it can feel like there's not a whole lot of space between me and the other person. And so that can really make me feel like all of their stuff is hitting me like inside of me. So I'd like to share with you a practice that I developed to really help me kind of walk into social situations, or kind of be a practice that I can move into quietly by myself when I am in a group of people and I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. So first things first is I want you to imagine an element that you really resonate with. So for me, that element is fire. I really love fire. I was a bit of a pyromaniac as a kid. I always played in candles and liked to light stuff on fire. But for me, there's something very beautiful about a flame. There's something comforting about the warmth that fire provides. And so for me, that my safe element, or the element that I really resonate with, is fire. And whichever one resonates with you, please go with that. So I imagine this fire inside of me in my center. And so for me, I really resonate with my center being where my solar plexus is, which is right above my belly button. And this is a good spot because in a group of people, I can fold my arms and put some pressure on my solar plexus. And I do this quite a lot. So just by creating that somatic touch there, I can really quickly move my awareness to my solar plexus. And so then I move into an image practice. So I like to imagine that in my solar plexus, there's this little flame. And I invite my whole imagination to take over my senses. So I can feel the warmth inside my body. I can feel that warmth contacting my hand that is on my solar plexus. And I start to imagine this flame getting bigger. So I imagine it getting tall and long and moving out and wide. And I stay with the sensation and I start to push it out of my body. So I push it, I make it bigger until my whole body feels like it's consumed by fire. And for me, this is a very pleasurable experience. So if fire isn't the element for you, please go with something else. And I can visualize this fire all over my skin and all over my body. And I start to imagine the barrier between me and the world getting a little bigger. So now there's more space between the fire and me and the world. And what I do is I start to play with how far can I push this energy of fire out from my body? Like how much space can I actually create? And then how close can I pull it? Can I pull it back in? And so for me, I tend to suck everything in. Like it's very easy for me to energetically pull towards myself. It's actually really hard for me to push outward. So when I am by myself, I will literally take my hands and physically push this energy out and imagine myself pushing it out and wider. And what this does is I'm physically getting the sensation of a push with my hands. So I'm engaging my body in this way. I can feel what a push feels like. And then once I can feel that sensation of that push, then I can make it a psychological gesture, meaning I can imagine myself pushing my hands out, pushing that fire out, and I get the same sensation in my body as when I physically do it. So now when I'm in a group of people, I don't have to be like pushing my hands in this way because maybe that would make me feel weird. Maybe I wouldn't do that in front of a group of people because I don't want attention drawn to me, especially when I'm needing to regulate. So instead, I just imagine myself feeling that sensation of pushing that energy out. And by engaging my imagination, by allowing my somatic experience to come online, what it does is it starts to remove the story, often the negative story, away from the sensations that I'm feeling in a group. So now what I do, so let's move back in time. So say we have a group of people over. I'm really excited to meet all of these people. Something starts to happen where I'm sitting in a group and I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. When I'm feeling overwhelmed, the story that I start to tell myself is that I'm bad, something's wrong with me. So right when I notice that that's starting to happen, I move into this practice of focusing on my energy body, of inviting the element of fire in, and I start to kind of play in the theater of my mind to give my mind a place to go that isn't negative, that isn't going to continue to activate me and make me feel overwhelmed. And what I've noticed is that when I catch it early enough, often I can dissipate that sensation of overwhelm. And then I have this choice of how close and how far am I energetically going to sit from this person. So for people who I have tracked that I feel really good with, I don't have to do this work. I don't have to, push my energy out and create like a distance. Where my energy naturally sits, which is pretty close to me, I feel really comfortable sitting with them. But with people who perhaps say I don't feel as safe with, or I don't feel as comfortable with, now I get to push my energy pretty far. And now I feel like I can control how close they are to me. Now, from a psychological perspective, we're getting into the realm of boundaries. And I just want to honor the fact that for folks that have experienced trauma, boundaries are really hard. And so if I start to cognitively move into, where are my boundaries? I need boundaries. I can actually start to activate myself. So by moving into this more creative space, moving into this more magical space, I then can bring in my spiritual practice where I feel the safest, and I can carry pieces of it with me when I'm in the real world or when I'm in spaces where I'm probably going to feel overwhelmed at some point. And this is kind of why I think a spiritual practice is really important, because it offers you a container and a place to explore and get really curious about what actually regulates your body, what actually calms you, what exercises or tools really feed your soul and give you the opportunity to have choice in whether you're just going to be taken off by this overwhelming sensation, or are you going to view this sensation with curiosity and go, ooh, what can I do with it? One of the gifts that I think highly sensitive people can offer, or empaths, is that I think we can really open other people to just how much a body can sense and just how much a person can feel. And when we can accept that we feel these things and we feel them deeply and we feel them intensely, and we can own that, I think it brings permission for other people to feel into their experience a little more deeply and to get curious about their feelings as well. So my wish for all of you listening is to simply be more curious. Curious about how did your sensitivity come to be? Curious how you feel towards your sensitivity, and curious about what you can do with it and how you might be able to be with it in a way that nourishes you and fills you up rather than being this overwhelming or draining experience. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. And also thank you to everyone who reached out to me. I really appreciate it. Also, I hope that some of these practices that I've shared can help you, or at least guide you on a path of finding what really works for you. All right, until next time, take care. Bye.